No one chooses a monster to be their husband, the Vampire King whispered to himself. Until the day the most beautiful woman in the kingdom proved every soul in the castle wrong. The bells of Blackthorn's citadel had not rung for a royal celebration in nearly 200 years. They echoed across the mountains only for council meetings, funerals, or declarations of war. Tonight, they rang for something stranger. A gathering unlike any in living memory. Beneath towering arches carved from black stone, nobles from every vampire house filled the grand hall with whispers that drifted like winter wind. Crystal chandeliers reflected thousands of candle flames across polished marble, while musicians played softly in the background, though no one seemed interested in the music. Every eye remained fixed on the obsidian throne at the end of the chamber. Vampire King Lucian Ashford sat perfectly still, dressed in a tailored black suit trimmed with silver, his pale face calm enough to resemble carved marble. His white skin almost glowed beneath the candlelight, making his silver-gray eyes appear even colder. Centuries had passed since he first wore a crown, yet tonight the weight of it seemed heavier than ever. Around him stood advisors, commanders, and members of the ancient council, each waiting for the ceremony to begin. They called it the Royal Courtship Assembly. Hundreds had attended over the centuries. None had ever succeeded. Lucian had rejected every proposal before a single conversation could begin. Some claimed he despised love. Others insisted his heart had turned to ice long before America had become a nation. The truth was much quieter. He simply believed no one could ever look beyond the crown, the endless power, and the curse that came with both. Somewhere deep inside, beneath centuries of discipline, lived a lonely certainty that no one could truly want him. They only wanted the throne, the wealth, the immortality, never the man. The chamber doors opened with deliberate grace. One by one, women from respected vampire families entered the hall, dressed in gowns stitched with gold and gemstones that shimmered beneath the lights. They offered elegant bows, rehearsed smiles, and carefully chosen words that sounded more like negotiations than affection. Lucian acknowledged each of them with polite silence. Not one reached his eyes. Minutes passed. Then an unexpected murmur swept through the crowd. Another figure had appeared at the entrance. She wasn't announced by trumpets. She wasn't escorted by nobles. She simply walked forward with quiet confidence, wearing an ivory dress without jewels, without a royal crest, without any symbol of status. Her golden hair rested gently over her shoulders, and her bright blue eyes carried neither fear nor ambition. Charlotte Hayes looked completely out of place among centuries-old aristocrats, yet somehow she seemed to belong more than any of them. Conversations faded. Even the musicians lowered their instruments. Council members exchanged confused glances. No one recognized her family name. No one understood how she had entered the palace. Lucian finally lifted his gaze toward the mysterious woman. For the first time that evening, something shifted behind his calm expression. Charlotte stopped exactly 10 feet from the throne. She smiled, not the practiced smile of someone seeking favor, but the warm smile of someone greeting an old friend she had finally found after a very long journey. Then, before anyone could question her presence, she looked directly into the eyes of the Vampire King and said with absolute certainty, "Marry me." Silence crashed across the grand hall so completely that the sound of a single candle flickering seemed impossibly loud. For several long seconds, no one moved. The silence spread through the throne room until it seemed to settle over every marble pillar and every crystal chandelier. Lucian Ashford remained seated, his expression unreadable, yet something unfamiliar flickered behind his silver eyes. It was not anger. It was not amusement. It was confusion, an emotion he had almost forgotten after 600 years of ruling. The members of the Royal Council exchanged uneasy glances before Lord Cedric finally stepped forward, clearing his throat with practiced dignity. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "this woman has broken every protocol of the Royal Courtship Assembly." Charlotte turned toward the elderly nobleman before he could continue. "Did I interrupt anyone?" she asked gently. The simple question caught him completely off guard. His prepared speech vanished. Around the hall, quiet whispers rippled through the gathered guests. She was not trembling. She was not begging for forgiveness. She stood with remarkable composure, as though speaking to the Vampire King were no different than greeting a neighbor on a peaceful afternoon. Lucian studied every detail about her. Her breathing remained calm. Her heartbeat never raced. Every visitor who had entered this chamber over the centuries had shown some trace of fear. He could hear it with supernatural clarity. Hearts skipped, breaths shortened, hands trembled. Charlotte displayed none of those signs. It was as though she had expected this meeting her entire life. "Do you know who I am?" Lucian finally asked, his deep voice carrying effortlessly through the chamber. Charlotte smiled softly. "Better than anyone here believes." Another wave of whispers swept across the nobles. Several council members frowned. Commander Roland instinctively shifted closer to the throne, not because Charlotte appeared dangerous, but because uncertainty itself had become dangerous. Lucian slowly rose from the obsidian throne. The movement alone silenced the entire room. Towering over everyone present, he descended the broad marble steps one at a time until only a few feet separated him from the mysterious woman. Up close, she looked even younger than he had first imagined, perhaps 28, with kind blue eyes that reflected the candlelight instead of shrinking from it. She did not lower her gaze. She simply looked at him with quiet warmth, the kind he had not seen directed toward him in centuries. "You have not answered my question," Lucian said. "Do you understand what it means to marry the Vampire King?" Charlotte nodded. "It means sharing your burdens instead of fearing them." Those words landed harder than any challenge ever spoken inside the throne room. For the first time in decades, Lucian had no immediate reply. The council certainly did. Lady Evelyn Blackmore stepped forward, her crimson gown flowing behind her. "This is manipulation," she declared. "No human could possibly understand His Majesty or our kingdom. She must have been sent here for political gain." Charlotte calmly turned toward the noblewoman. "If I wanted power, I would have asked for the crown. I asked for the man wearing it." The chamber fell silent once again. Lucian felt something impossible stir beneath the walls he had spent centuries building around his heart. Not trust, not love, something much smaller, yet infinitely more dangerous. Hope. Before anyone could speak again, an elderly servant hurried into the hall carrying an ancient leather journal wrapped in faded blue cloth. He bowed deeply before Lucian. "Forgive the interruption, Your Majesty, but this volume was discovered inside the sealed royal archives only moments ago." Lucian accepted the weathered journal with quiet curiosity. Dust drifted into the candlelight as he carefully opened the first page. His expression changed instantly. Written across the yellowed parchment in elegant handwriting were words that had not been seen for over 300 years. "When the loneliest king no longer believes himself worthy of love, the woman destined to save both his heart and his kingdom will be the first to ask for his hand." The ancient journal felt unexpectedly warm in Lucian's hands, as though it had been waiting centuries to be opened. Every noble in the hall leaned forward, hoping to catch another glimpse of the faded words, but the ink began to shimmer before their eyes, slowly disappearing from the page until only Lucian could still see what remained. His fingers tightened around the weathered leather cover. Beneath the first prophecy, another sentence slowly emerged in graceful handwriting. "She will remember what the king has forgotten." Lucian looked up at Charlotte, searching her face for answers she should not possess. "Who are you?" he asked quietly, abandoning every royal title and formal greeting. Charlotte did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, stopping just outside the respectful distance expected before a throne. The candles surrounding the chamber flickered. Gently, although no breeze entered the hall. "I could tell you my story," she said softly, "but you would not believe it yet." The council erupted into anxious whispers. Lord Cedric folded his arms. "Your Majesty, enough of this mystery. She refuses to identify herself properly. She speaks as though she belongs here. We should escort her from the citadel until her background has been thoroughly investigated." Lucian never took his eyes off Charlotte. "Where did you find the courage to walk into this room?" he asked. Charlotte smiled with quiet sadness. "Courage usually arrives after you have spent years with nothing left to lose." Those words settled heavily inside Lucian's mind. They did not sound rehearsed. They sounded lived. He had heard countless speeches from diplomats, queens, generals, and scholars. None of them had ever spoken with such simple honesty. Slowly, Charlotte lifted the silver pendant resting beneath the collar of her dress. It was small, shaped like a crescent moon embracing a single star. The moment Lucian saw it, An unfamiliar ache stirred inside his memory. He had seen that symbol before, somewhere far beyond living memory, somewhere buried beneath centuries of battles, treaties, and endless responsibilities. That necklace, he whispered. Where did you get it? Charlotte lowered her eyes to the pendant. My grandmother gave it to me before she passed away. She always told me that one day I would meet a lonely king who had forgotten how to smile. Lucian felt the chamber disappear around him. For one impossible heartbeat, another image flashed through his mind. A peaceful hillside covered in white flowers. Warm sunlight instead of moonlight. The laughter of a young woman whose face remained hidden behind drifting petals. Then the vision vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Lucian blinked, disturbed by the memory that refused to fully reveal itself. Commander Roland noticed the king's hesitation and stepped closer. Your Majesty, are you well? Lucian nodded slowly, although he was no longer certain. He had not experienced an involuntary memory in centuries. Something about Charlotte was unlocking doors inside his mind that he had believed permanently sealed. Across the chamber, Lady Evelyn Blackmore watched the exchange with growing concern. She had expected the mysterious human woman to embarrass herself. Instead, every passing minute seemed to deepen the king's interest. That alone threatened the careful balance of influence within the royal court. Before anyone could speak again, the stained glass windows overlooking the mountains suddenly filled with brilliant moonlight. The silver glow poured into the throne room, illuminating Charlotte's pendant. Tiny lines of light spread across its surface until they formed an intricate pattern unlike anything the council had ever witnessed. Gasps echoed through the chamber. The same pattern appeared beneath Lucian's left wrist, glowing faintly beneath his pale skin before fading almost as quickly as it had emerged. Charlotte looked down in quiet surprise. Lucian stared at his wrist in stunned silence. No pain, no fear, only the unmistakable feeling that destiny had just taken its very first visible step. Moonlight lingered across the marble floor long after the glowing pattern disappeared from Lucian's wrist. No one in the throne room dared to speak first. The silence itself had become part of the mystery. Every noble present understood the significance of what they had witnessed, even if none of them could explain it. Symbols tied to the ancient bloodlines had not appeared in public for generations. They belonged to forgotten legends, not living history. Lucian slowly lowered his hand, his gaze never leaving Charlotte. She looked as surprised as everyone else. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at becoming the center of attention. Instead, she studied the pendant resting against her chest, as though it had revealed a secret she had never known existed. Lord Cedric broke the silence with unusual urgency. Your Majesty, this changes everything. The council cannot ignore an unknown woman carrying an artifact connected to the oldest royal prophecies. Lady Evelyn stepped beside him, her calm voice carrying through the chamber. Then we should remove the pendant immediately and place it inside the royal vault until its origin has been confirmed. Charlotte instinctively placed her hand over the silver necklace. I cannot give it to you, she said quietly. It was my grandmother's final gift. That is no longer your decision, Lady Evelyn replied. If the artifact threatens the kingdom, it belongs to the crown. Before another word could be spoken, Lucian raised one hand. The hall fell silent at once. No one will touch her pendant. His voice remained calm, yet every syllable carried unquestionable authority. Lady Evelyn lowered her eyes respectfully, though disappointment briefly crossed her face. Lucian stepped closer to Charlotte, stopping just far enough away to respect her space. You said your grandmother gave this to you. Tell me about her. Charlotte smiled faintly, as though remembering someone she missed every day. Her name was Eleanor Hayes. She raised me after my parents passed away. We lived in a small white farmhouse beside Lake Ashwood, about 80 miles south of these mountains. She never spoke about royalty. She never mentioned vampires. But every birthday, she told me the same story before giving me the necklace. Lucian listened without interruption. She always said there would come a night when I would stop searching for my future because my future would already be searching for me. I thought she was simply trying to comfort a lonely little girl. The words settled gently over the room. They carried no grand speeches, no dramatic declarations, only quiet sincerity. Lucian found himself imagining the little farmhouse, the peaceful lake, and a grandmother carefully placing the pendant into a child's hands with hope instead of fear. It was a scene so ordinary that it somehow felt extraordinary inside a castle built upon centuries of power. An elderly librarian suddenly hurried toward the throne carrying another collection of dusty scrolls. His breathing was uneven from climbing the endless staircases of the royal archives. He bowed deeply before speaking. "Your Majesty, I searched every record connected to the prophecy. There is only one surviving illustration." He carefully unrolled a faded parchment across a nearby table. The nobles immediately gathered around. Time had nearly erased the colors, but one image remained unmistakably clear. A young woman wearing a crescent moon pendant stood beside a pale king beneath a sky filled with silver stars. Between them rested the same intricate symbol that had appeared only moments ago beneath Lucian's wrist. At the bottom of the illustration, written in elegant script worn by centuries, were simple words that made the room grow silent once again. The first sign appears before either heart understands why. Lucian slowly looked from the ancient drawing to Charlotte. She met his eyes with the same quiet smile she had worn since entering the throne room. Neither of them noticed that beyond the towering stained glass windows, hidden among the shadows of the distant castle walls, an unseen figure had quietly witnessed every moment of the impossible meeting. The mysterious figure beyond the castle walls disappeared into the darkness before any guard noticed the silent observer. Inside the throne room, however, the atmosphere had already changed. What had begun as a ceremonial gathering now felt like the opening chapter of something far older than anyone present could fully understand. Lucian remained beside Charlotte instead of returning to his throne. The decision was subtle, yet every member of the royal council recognized its significance. For centuries, the Vampire King had always maintained a careful distance from every guest who entered the Great Hall. Tonight, for the first time in living memory, he had chosen to stand beside someone rather than above them. Lord Cedric folded the ancient illustration and looked toward the king with measured concern. "Your Majesty, regardless of what these prophecies suggest, the kingdom must proceed carefully. The appearance of ancient signs has always drawn unwanted attention." Lucian nodded thoughtfully. "I agree." The council members relaxed slightly, believing he would order Charlotte removed until further investigation could be completed. Instead, Lucian turned toward the captain of the palace staff. "Prepare the East Garden residence." The captain blinked in surprise. "For the royal guests, Your Majesty?" "For Miss Charlotte Hayes." The room erupted into quiet astonishment. The East Garden residence had not welcomed an outsider in nearly 100 years. Nestled behind the castle's ancient greenhouse, it overlooked the peaceful cliffs where moonflowers bloomed throughout every season. Reserved only for those under the king's direct protection, it was considered one of the safest places inside Blackthorn Citadel. Lady Evelyn took one careful step forward. "Your Majesty, with respect, granting her residence inside the castle before confirming her identity may encourage unnecessary speculation among the noble houses." Lucian met her eyes calmly. "Speculation has never endangered this kingdom. Fear has." His answer left no room for further debate. Charlotte looked genuinely surprised. "You barely know me," she said softly. Lucian allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. "That is exactly why I prefer you remain where I can ask questions instead of wondering where you have gone." A few nobles exchanged amused glances. It was the closest anyone had heard the king come to making a joke in decades. Charlotte smiled in return, and for a brief moment the enormous hall seemed less like a fortress and more like a home that had been waiting too long for laughter to return. As servants quietly prepared to escort Charlotte through the eastern corridors, the elderly librarian approached her with visible hesitation. From inside his robe, he carefully removed a tiny silver key attached to a faded blue ribbon. "My lady," he said gently, "this key was discovered inside the same archive as the prophecy. No lock within the castle matches it. I believe it was meant for whoever carried the crescent moon pendant." Charlotte accepted the key with both hands, studying its intricate design. Tiny stars had been engraved along its handle, surrounding a single crescent moon identical to the symbol resting against her chest. Before she could ask another question, a soft breeze drifted through the open windows carrying the delicate fragrance of blooming jasmine from the gardens below. Lucian closed his eyes for only a heartbeat. The scent awakened another fragment of memory. He heard distant laughter again. He saw sunlight reflecting across a quiet lake. A little girl no older than 7 held up a silver key and laughed as though she had discovered the greatest treasure in the world. The vision vanished before he could see her face. Lucian opened his eyes slowly, unsettled by the growing collection of forgotten memories. Charlotte noticed the change in his expression. "Did you remember something?" she asked. Lucian hesitated before answering honestly. "Not enough." As the palace doors opened toward the moonlit gardens, neither of them realized that somewhere beneath Blackthorn's citadel, hidden behind walls untouched for centuries, a lock fashioned with a crescent moon quietly turned by itself for the very first time in 300 years. Charlotte followed the palace attendants through a series of quiet corridors where polished stone reflected the soft glow of antique lanterns. Unlike the grand halls reserved for ceremonies, these passageways felt personal, almost untouched by time. Portraits of forgotten kings lined the walls, their pale faces watching silently, as though they had witnessed countless destinies unfold beneath the same ceiling. The East Garden residence stood beyond an iron gate covered in climbing white roses that somehow bloomed despite the cool mountain air. As the gate opened, Charlotte paused. Before her stretched a peaceful courtyard filled with moonflowers, silver fountains, and ancient oak trees whose branches swayed gently beneath the starlit sky. It did not resemble the home of feared rulers. It resembled a place built for someone who had once believed happiness could last forever. An elderly housekeeper named Margaret welcomed Charlotte with a warm smile that carried none of the suspicion found elsewhere in the castle. "His Majesty ordered everything to be prepared before you arrived," she said kindly. "If there is anything you need, simply ask." Charlotte looked around the elegant residence with quiet disbelief. "It is beautiful." Margaret nodded. "It used to belong to someone very dear to the royal family many years ago. Since then, no one has lived here." Charlotte glanced toward the moonlit garden outside the tall windows. A strange sense of familiarity settled over her heart. She had never visited Blackthorn's citadel before tonight, yet the fragrance of the flowers, the sound of the fountain, even the arrangement of the stone paths all felt oddly familiar, like fragments of a forgotten dream. Meanwhile, in the highest tower of the castle, Lucian stood alone inside the royal observatory overlooking the sleeping kingdom below. Commander Roland entered quietly, stopping several feet behind the king. "Your Majesty, scouts have reported unusual movement along the northern forests. Nothing threatening yet, but more travelers than usual seem to be approaching the capital." Lucian continued gazing through the enormous glass dome above. "Word has already spread." Roland nodded. "The appearance of the prophecy cannot remain secret for long." Lucian understood better than anyone. Ancient kingdoms were built upon stories, and stories traveled faster than armies. By sunrise, every noble house would know that an unknown human woman had awakened symbols thought lost to history. Roland hesitated before asking, "Do you trust her?" Lucian remained silent for several moments. Finally, he answered with complete honesty. "I trust that she believes every word she says. Whether I understand those words is another matter." The commander accepted the answer without question. After Roland departed, Lucian walked toward an old wooden cabinet hidden behind shelves of astronomy books. He unlocked it with a silver key worn smooth by centuries of use, and carefully removed a small velvet box. Inside rested a faded painting no larger than his hand. Time had softened its colors, but one detail remained unmistakably clear. Around the neck of the smiling young woman in the portrait hung a crescent moon pendant identical to Charlotte's. Lucian closed his eyes, struggling to force another memory to return, but only scattered images appeared. White flowers, laughter beside a quiet lake, a promise he could almost hear but never fully remember. At that same moment, inside the East Garden residence, Charlotte placed the mysterious silver key upon the bedside table before preparing to rest. The instant the key touched the polished wood, it began to emit a gentle silver glow. Charlotte stepped back in surprise as tiny points of light drifted upward from its surface like floating stars. They gathered in the air, slowly forming the outline of a doorway before fading just as quickly as they had appeared. Margaret hurried into the room after noticing the strange light. She stared at the now ordinary key with astonishment before whispering words that made Charlotte's heart skip with curiosity. "Impossible. That key has started looking for its door." Margaret's quiet words lingered in the room long after the silver glow disappeared. Charlotte looked from the ordinary-looking key to the elderly housekeeper, unsure whether she had imagined the strange vision. "Looking for its door?" she asked softly. Margaret nodded with remarkable certainty. The old caretakers used to tell stories about the moon key. They believed it was never made to unlock a door by force. It would simply awaken whenever the right person finally carried it home. Charlotte gently picked up the small silver key again. It felt slightly warmer than before, as though it recognized her touch. "Did anyone ever find the door?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Not in my lifetime. Most people believe the stories were only fairy tales meant to comfort lonely children." Charlotte lowered her eyes to the crescent pendant resting against her chest. Somehow, nothing about tonight felt like a fairy tale. Everything felt astonishingly real. At the same hour, Lucian left the royal observatory and walked alone through the castle's oldest corridors. He dismissed the guards who normally accompanied him. Tonight he needed silence more than protection. His footsteps echoed across polished stone until he reached a forgotten gallery overlooking the moonlit gardens. From there he could see the East Garden residence glowing gently among the white roses. One upstairs window remained illuminated. Charlotte was still awake. Lucian rested one hand against the cold stone railing. 600 years of discipline had taught him to distrust coincidence. Yet every event of the evening refused to fit inside reason. The prophecy, the pendant, the symbol beneath his wrist, the memories returning without invitation. Even more unsettling was the peace he felt whenever Charlotte spoke. It was unfamiliar, almost dangerous in its quietness. He had spent centuries believing that peace belonged to ordinary lives, not kings burdened with endless responsibility. Behind him, soft footsteps approached. The elderly librarian stopped beside the king, carrying another weathered journal recovered from the deepest section of the archives. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully. "I continued searching after the council adjourned. I found one additional record connected to the moon key." Lucian accepted the journal and carefully turned its fragile pages. Most had faded beyond recognition, but one passage remained surprisingly clear. "Only when the keeper of the key willingly chooses the lonely king before discovering his hidden inheritance will the forgotten path reveal itself." Lucian read the sentence twice. Charlotte had proposed marriage before learning anything about prophecies, symbols, or ancient treasures. According to the journal, that single choice mattered more than anyone had realized. "There is more," the librarian whispered. "The forgotten path does not lead to gold or power. Every surviving record simply calls it the Chamber of Promises." Lucian slowly closed the journal. "No map." The old man shook his head. "Only one clue. The chamber can never be found by searching for it. It appears only when two people stop searching for themselves." The words settled into the quiet night like falling snow. Before Lucian could respond, a distant melody drifted through the gardens below. It was soft, almost impossible to hear, yet unmistakably familiar. Charlotte stood beside the fountain outside the East Garden residence, humming a gentle lullaby while gazing at the stars. Lucian froze. His eyes widened with quiet disbelief. He knew that melody. He had not heard it in over 300 years. Without realizing it, he whispered the final line before Charlotte sang it herself. Their voices met across the moonlit gardens, finishing the forgotten lullaby together. Charlotte looked up in surprise toward the gallery where Lucian stood. Neither of them spoke. Another word. They simply stared across the silver-lit distance, both wondering how two strangers could possibly remember the same song that history itself had forgotten. Charlotte lowered her gaze only after the final note faded into the quiet night. The fountain continued its gentle rhythm, and the white moonflowers swayed beneath the cool breeze as though the gardens themselves had recognized the forgotten melody. She rested one hand over the crescent pendant, trying to understand why singing that simple lullaby had filled her heart with both comfort and sorrow. When she looked toward the gallery again, Lucian was no longer standing there. Yet somehow she knew he had heard every word. High above the gardens, Lucian walked slowly through the silent corridors, unable to escape the echo of the song. He had spent centuries mastering every corner of his own mind, locking painful memories behind walls that time itself could not break. Tonight those walls had begun to crack without warning. He entered the royal library before dawn, where thousands of books rested beneath towering shelves carved from ancient oak. The elderly librarian was still awake, carefully restoring fragile manuscripts by candlelight. He looked up as Lucian approached. "You heard it too," the old man said quietly. Lucian nodded. "I finished the final verse before she did." The librarian closed the manuscript in his hands. "There are songs that belong to history, Your Majesty. Then there are songs that belong to promises." Lucian remained silent. "I searched every collection we possess," the librarian continued. "Only one record mentions that lullaby. According to the oldest royal journals, it was never performed in public. It was sung only between two people who intended to build a future together." Lucian felt another fragment of memory stir beneath the surface. A peaceful evening beside a quiet lake. Fireflies drifting through the air. A woman's gentle voice asking him to remember the melody no matter how many years passed. He reached for the memory, but once again it dissolved before revealing her face. Meanwhile, Charlotte found herself unable to sleep. She wandered through the East Garden residence until she reached a circular room filled with antique maps and botanical sketches. A large window overlooked the castle grounds where the first hints of dawn had begun to soften the horizon. As she traced her fingers across an old wooden table, she noticed something unusual. The silver key resting in her hand had begun pointing in a single direction, slowly turning by itself like a compass guided by an invisible force. It settled toward the northern wing of Blackthorn Citadel. Charlotte frowned with curiosity. "You know where you belong, do not you?" she whispered. The key responded with another faint silver glow. Before she could examine it further, Margaret entered carrying a breakfast tray. She stopped the moment she noticed the glowing key. "It is becoming stronger already," the housekeeper murmured. Charlotte looked up. "What happens when it finally finds the door?" Margaret hesitated. The legends never agreed. Some believed it would restore something that had been lost. Others feared it would awaken truths that people had chosen to forget. Charlotte looked through the window toward the vast castle rising beyond the gardens. For reasons she could not explain, she felt no fear. Only an overwhelming certainty that she had not come to Blackthorn Citadel by accident. At that very moment, deep beneath the castle, hidden beyond forgotten stone passages, the ancient chamber continued awakening. Dust drifted gently from its ceiling as mechanisms untouched for centuries quietly turned. At the center of the chamber stood a single marble pedestal illuminated by a shaft of silver morning light filtering through cracks in the mountain above. Resting upon the pedestal lay an unopened letter sealed with the royal crest. As the first ray of sunlight reached the faded parchment, the wax seal slowly shimmered, revealing words that had remained hidden for 300 years. To Lucian and Charlotte. If you are reading this, then both of you remembered each other later than I hoped, but sooner than destiny feared. Morning sunlight spread gently across Blackthorn Citadel, washing the ancient stone towers in soft shades of gold instead of silver. For the first time in centuries, the castle felt different. Servants smiled without knowing why. The gardens seemed brighter. Even the endless mountain wind carried an unexpected warmth through the open courtyards. Charlotte stood beside the fountain with the silver key resting in her palm. It had stopped glowing, yet it still pointed steadily toward the northern wing of the castle. She looked up as quiet footsteps approached. Lucian walked through the garden without guards or royal attendants, dressed simply in a charcoal coat that made him appear less like a ruler and more like a man searching for answers. His pale face reflected the early light, and although his expression remained composed, his silver eyes carried a gentleness that had not been there the night before. They stopped only a few feet apart. Neither of them hurried to speak. Somehow silence no longer felt uncomfortable between them. It felt familiar. Lucian noticed the key first. "It is still guiding you." Charlotte nodded. "It refuses to point anywhere else." Lucian smiled faintly. "Perhaps it has grown tired of waiting." Charlotte laughed softly, and the simple sound echoed across the quiet garden. The laughter stirred another forgotten memory inside Lucian. This time it stayed. He remembered standing beside a peaceful lake centuries ago, promising someone that no matter how long time separated them, kindness would always find its way home. The memory remained incomplete, yet it no longer disappeared. Charlotte watched his expression change. "You remembered something again." Lucian nodded slowly. "Only pieces, but they no longer feel like dreams." Before either of them could continue, the silver key suddenly grew warm once more. It lifted slightly within Charlotte's hand, gently pulling toward the castle itself. At that exact moment, deep beneath Blackthorn Citadel, the ancient chamber released a low, resonant sound that traveled silently through the mountain like a heartbeat finally awakening. Neither fear nor alarm followed. Instead, the castle seemed to welcome the sound. Hidden doors that had remained sealed for generations quietly unlocked. Dust drifted from forgotten ceilings. Long dark lanterns, illuminated one after another without anyone touching them. The path had finally opened. Margaret hurried into the garden, slightly out of breath but smiling through her astonishment. "Your Majesty," she said, "the northern passage has appeared." The old walls moved on their own. Lucian looked toward the towering castle before turning back to Charlotte. "Would you walk with me?" Charlotte answered with the same quiet confidence she had shown from the moment they first met. "I have been walking toward this place for longer than I realized." Together they crossed the gardens toward the ancient passage. As they entered the hidden corridor, the silver key floated gently from Charlotte's hand and unlocked the final stone door without making a sound. Beyond it rested the marble pedestal exactly as the legends had described. The sealed letter waited patiently beneath a beam of morning light. Lucian carefully lifted the parchment while Charlotte stood beside him. This time, when the seal opened, the writing remained visible to them both. It read, "If your hearts have brought you here, then the prophecy has already fulfilled its greatest purpose." The kingdom was never waiting for a queen chosen by power. It was waiting for a woman chosen by compassion. And the king was never meant to conquer loneliness. He was meant to release it. Lucian slowly lowered the letter. He turned toward Charlotte, no longer seeing a mysterious stranger, but someone whose kindness had quietly reached places inside him that centuries of strength never could. Charlotte smiled, her blue eyes reflecting the morning light that filled the hidden chamber. She gently offered him her hand once more. This time, Lucian accepted without hesitation. As sunlight poured through the ancient room, the symbols beneath their wrists appeared one final time before dissolving into soft silver light, leaving only peace behind. Outside, the bells of Blackthorn's citadel rang across the mountains once again, not to announce war or mourning, but to celebrate the beginning of a future built not upon fear, prophecy, or power, but upon two hearts that had finally remembered how to find each other.